There exists, somewhere in the accumulated wealth of the American continent, a fortune so vast that if you were to count it in single-dollar bills at the rate of 1 per second, you would still be counting, without pause, without sleep, for nearly 8,000 years. And it all began with a man in a pickup truck studying the price of women's hosiery on a Saturday morning in 1950s Arkansas, scribbling notes on a pad he kept on the passenger seat. The engine ticks as it cools. That sound, the metal contracting in the pre-dawn chill of the Ozark foothills, is where we begin, because everything that follows, every store, every checkout lane, every distribution center that would come to bind this nation together in a web of commerce, started with a man who paid attention to small sounds, small details, small towns that the rest of America had largely forgotten. It is sometime in the early morning hours, perhaps 4 or 5 o'clock, when the world still belongs mostly to itself. The sky above rural Arkansas holds that particular shade of deep blue that exists only before sunrise, when the stars are fading, but the sun has not yet begun its work. A gravel road stretches out through low hills dotted with pine and oak, and on this road sits a Chevrolet pickup truck, dust still settling on its hood from yesterday's travel. The radio inside, if it were on, would carry nothing but static or the distant murmur of a station broadcasting from Memphis or Little Rock, too far away to matter much to the people who live out here. Inside the cab, if anyone were to look through the windshield, they would see a man perhaps 40 years old, weathered in the way that people become weathered when they work outdoors and think constantly about things they cannot control. His hands are on the steering wheel, but they are still resting. There is a leather journal on the seat beside him, and a pencil, worn down from use. The cab smells of dust and coffee, and the faint sweetness of motor oil. These are the textures of the world he knows, not the world of boardrooms or Manhattan office towers, but the actual physical world of small American towns, where people wake before dawn because the work of living cannot wait. If we were to trace this moment backward, we would find that this man, Sam Walton, has been driving these roads for months now. He has driven them in daylight and in darkness, in rain and in the clear, dry heat of summer. He has stopped at small stores in small towns and stood in the aisles, watching, listening, taking notes. He has looked at the way merchandise is arranged, the way prices are marked, the way customers move through a space. He has thought about what people need and what they are willing to spend. He has thought about the space between what a store pays for something and what it sells it for, and whether that distance might be bridged in a way that no one else in rural America has quite imagined. The pickup truck. There is something almost sacred about starting here, with this vehicle, rather than with a family tree or a financial prospectus. Because the pickup truck is honest. It is a tool. It does not pretend to be more than it is. It carries things. It goes places where fancier vehicles would get stuck in the mud. It belongs to a kind of American self-reliance that had not yet been entirely replaced by the suburban dream spreading out from the coasts. To sit in a pickup truck at 4 in the morning in the Ozarks is to be part of a landscape that was already becoming nostalgic, even as it still existed, a rural America that was about to be transformed, though Sam Walton did not yet know that he himself would be the instrument of that transformation. The cooling engine ticks. The sound is the sound of heat leaving metal, of energy being released back into the universe. It is the sound of a night's work completed, or perhaps of waiting that is about to end. The gravel beneath the wheels of the truck holds the memory of countless other vehicles that have passed over it, and it will hold the memory of this one too, though no one passing this way today would know that a man sat here and thought thoughts that would eventually alter the economic life of an entire nation. We are drawn into the sensory world of the 1950s Ozarks, not through nostalgia, but through the actual texture of the air and the light and the sounds that Sam Walton inhabited as a young man trying to make his way in the world. This is a world of limited information. There is no internet, no instant access to data about competitors hundreds of miles away. To know what a store in Memphis is doing with its pricing, you have to drive there, or you have to have friends who drive there and tell you. Knowledge is precious, and it must be gathered slowly, deliberately, methodically. This is the world Sam Walton moved through, and it was a world that suited his temperament perfectly. If you've ever wondered how a single man with modest beginnings could build something so large that it would reshape American retail, American labor, American agriculture, and the basic structure of small-town commerce itself, if you've thought about what it takes to see possibility where others see only limitation, then this is the story we're going to travel through together, slowly and without rushing. If you'd like to join us on this deep, unfolding journey into how the Walton family built a $250 billion fortune from the ground up, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this documentary series, where we explore the slow, methodical rise of American business empires through the lives of the people who built them. This is not a story of overnight success. It is a story of attention paid to small details, of resilience in the face of setbacks, of a family that learned to scale something without losing touch with the values it started with. The sky above the Ozarks is beginning to lighten now, just barely. The faintest suggestion of grey creeps in at the eastern horizon. Soon the day will begin, and the pickup truck will start moving again, and Sam Walton will continue his work of observing and learning and imagining a different way forward. But in this moment, suspended between night and day, we can sit with him in the cab of his truck and understand that nothing about his life has been accidental. Everything he does, from the way he drives to the way he thinks about pricing, has grown out of a childhood and young adulthood spent learning the small, crucial arts of thrift, hard work, and genuine attention to the people around him. The Depression left marks on the people who lived through it, marks that never quite faded, even after the economy recovered and America moved into its period of post-war prosperity. Sam Walton was born too late to remember the earliest, worst years of the Depression, but he was born into a family shaped entirely by its lessons. His father, Thomas Gibson Walton, was a man who understood the fragility of economic life, who understood how quickly circumstances could change, who understood that the only reliable thing in the world was the work you could do with your own hands and the intelligence you could apply to solving problems. These lessons would be passed down, not in the form of explicit instruction necessarily, but through the quiet example of a man moving through the world with purpose and care. This is where the story of a $250 billion fortune actually begins, not in a moment of dramatic insight or a sudden stroke of genius, but in the darkness before dawn, in a pickup truck parked on a gravel road in the Ozarks, with a man who is paying attention. The fortune would come later, the stores would come later, the public offering and the stock prices, and the wealth that would eventually make the Walton family one of the richest families on earth. All of that would come much later. But right now, in this moment that we are inhabiting together, we are present at the very beginning of something, and the beginning is always quiet, always humble, always smaller than we expect it to be. You know, there's something about the way a fortune builds in the quiet hours, doesn't there? Not in the flash of stock tickers or the sharp crack of boardroom deals, but in the patient, almost meditative accumulation of small choices repeated thousands of times across decades and generations. And that's where the Walton story lives, in that slower, deeper current of American life. It's a story that deserves to be told not as a business case study, bristling with metrics and quarterly growth, but as something closer to a bedtime history, the kind of narrative that unfolds the way memory unfolds, moving forward yet somehow always circling back to the place where it began. If you find yourself drawn to the way wealth and family intertwine, to the mysteries of how one man's restlessness in rural Arkansas eventually touched nearly every corner of American commerce. I'd like to invite you to follow along with us as we trace this $250 billion journey, step by patient step. This is the sort of chronicle that reveals itself best in the hours before sleep, when the mind is open to the texture of history, to the weight of consequence that accumulates across generations. Think of it as settling in, not for a lecture on retail strategy or financial mechanics, but for an extended conversation about ambition, legacy, and the peculiar alchemy through which one family's hunger to do things differently quietly reshaped the American landscape. The Walton story is, in many ways, a meditation on the relationship between persistence and circumstance, between what one person can will into existence and what the moment itself offers. It's a tale of how a pickup truck, a small-town mind, and an unswerving belief in the customer could compound into something so vast that it touches the lives of millions of people every single day, most of whom will never know the name of the man who started it all. And there's something almost restful about that unknowing, isn't there? The way great things often grow quietly, without fanfare, in the margins of places most of us never think about. So settle in with us for this slow examination of the Walton rise. We'll move through the Depression-era lessons that shaped young Sam, through the small failures that taught him more than his successes ever could, through the quiet revolution of a discount model that most experts thought would fail. We'll sit with the family as they built something together, as they navigated the peculiar burden of extraordinary wealth while trying to hold on to the humility that made them who they were. And we'll consider, with unhurried reflection, what it all means, how a fortune of this magnitude comes to be, what it costs, and what it changes. This is history not as a rush of events, but as a slow unveiling. So let's begin, now, with the childhood of a man who would eventually alter the American way of shopping, entirely by accident, through nothing more elaborate than the conviction that working people deserved a fair price and that small towns deserved to be taken seriously. To understand how a man with a pickup truck could build something so vast, you must first understand the household where he learned to notice what others overlooked. Samuel Moore Walton was born in 1918 in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, arriving into a world already shaped by scarcity, by the peculiar mathematics of survival that the American heartland would come to know so intimately over the following decade. His father, Thomas Gibson Walton, was a man of particular temperament, not cruel, but deliberate, methodical in ways that seemed to organize everything around the edges of profit and loss. Thomas Gibson had made his living as a farm mortgage collector. Picture this work for a moment. Driving across the red clay roads of rural Oklahoma during the 1920s, carrying with him the ledgers and the expectations of banks located in distant cities. He would arrive at farmsteads where families had already begun to feel the first tremors of what would become the Great Collapse. His job was to assess, to calculate, to sometimes deliver news that a family could no longer keep what they believed was theirs. It was not pleasant work, but it was educational in ways that young Sam would absorb almost without knowing it. The lessons came not through lectures but through observation. When you grow up watching your father move through rural commerce, learning how to read a farm's condition from the state of its fences, how to calculate a family's desperation from the quality of their crops, you begin to develop an instinct about value and vulnerability that most children never acquire. Sam's mother, Nancy Etta, provided a counterbalance. She was, by most accounts, gentler in her approach to the world, but it was the pragmatism of his father's work that seemed to shape young Sam's earliest understanding of how economies actually function at their foundation. The family moved frequently, as families in Thomas Gibson's line of work often did, from Oklahoma to Missouri, from one small town to another, each move carrying Sam deeper into the texture of rural American life during the prosperous 20s and then the unraveling 30s. What comes to mind when you consider a child growing up during the Depression? Not simply poverty, though there was genuine hardship, but a kind of collective understanding that abundance could not be assumed. That waste was not merely bad manners, but a form of moral failure. That understanding what people needed and what they could afford were not abstract economic concepts, but the grammar of survival itself. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but revealing in its resonance, that young Sam would stand outside stores and watch customers leave, noting what they purchased and what they left behind, already sensing the silent calculation in every transaction. Whether or not this particular memory is precisely accurate, it captures something true about the temperament that seemed to emerge, an almost obsessive attention to the relationship between desire and price, between what people genuinely needed and what sellers convinced them they wanted. His father's work provided something else too, a window into the machinery of commercial networks. A farm mortgage collector in rural America wasn't simply a bill collector. He was someone who understood credit, who grasped the architecture of debt and obligation that held the agricultural economy together. He knew which banks were reliable, which were desperate, which farmers were genuinely at risk, and which were merely struggling through a temporary season. This kind of information, circulating through dinner-table conversations, sank into young Sam's consciousness like water into drought-cracked earth. The Depression itself, when it arrived with full force in 1929, did not devastate the Walton family the way it destroyed so many others. Thomas Gibson's position, ironic as it may seem, was relatively stable. His services became even more essential as the economic machinery began to jam. And while the family was never wealthy, they were insulated from the worst deprivation. But this insulation did not breed callousness or indifference. Instead, it seemed to create in Sam a kind of double consciousness, an awareness of both the fragility of ordinary people's circumstances and the cold logic of how systems actually allocated resources. By the time Sam reached adolescence, he had absorbed, almost osmotically, a particular worldview. Money was not abstract or shameful. It was the practical medium through which life's necessities were negotiated. Thrift was not a matter of deprivation, but of respect for resources, and paying attention to what ordinary people needed and at what price they could afford it was not a cynical calculation, but the foundation of any sustainable enterprise. These were not revolutionary insights, but they were held with an intensity, a kind of intellectual precision that would later distinguish him from competitors who treated business more casually. The Depression wore on, year after year, and the Walton family moved again, this time to Missouri. Sam's father eventually found work in different ventures. He became involved in real estate, in insurance, always in pursuits that required reading the gap between people's circumstances and their aspirations. It was an education in market psychology, delivered not through textbooks, but through the lived reality of watching how financial systems pressed down on rural America. What did a farmer do when he could no longer pay his debts? What did a merchant do when customers had no cash? What happened when prices fell and fell until nothing seemed to hold value anymore? These were not abstract questions for young Sam. They were the texture of the world he inhabited during his formative years. And though he could not have articulated it at the time, he was learning the fundamental insight that would eventually shape everything, that there existed, in the gaps between rural communities and commercial networks, an enormous untapped opportunity, that people in small towns needed access to affordable goods, that merchants in those towns were often limited by their own isolation, their distance from wholesale supply chains, their vulnerability to larger distributors, that if someone could figure out how to connect rural customers directly to efficient sourcing, something remarkable might unfold. But all of this remained, for now, in the realm of absorbed intuition rather than conscious strategy. Sam was simply a boy growing up in a particular time and place, watching his father move through the machinery of rural commerce, developing an eye for what mattered and what didn't, learning the peculiar calculus of small-town America during its most difficult years. He did not yet know that he would one day return to this landscape, not as a collector or an assessor, but as someone who would fundamentally reshape how rural America shopped and lived and understood what was possible within the boundaries of their modest means. The path that Sam Walton would eventually trace across America's rural landscape began not in a store, but in a classroom, and in a place that demanded he think differently about the very nature of retail itself. In the late 1930s, when the country was still finding its footing after the collapse, Sam enrolled at the University of Missouri, carrying with him the habits his father had instilled: the careful eye for value, the quiet courtesy, the understanding that a dollar meant something. What is it, we might wonder, that transforms a farm boy into a merchant? Perhaps it begins with watching and with listening to the rhythms of how commerce actually works. At Missouri, Sam studied economics and business administration, though the campus itself was a world away from the Ozark Hills. The depression lingered in the air even there, and many of his fellow students worked their way through their studies, much as he did. He was not remarkable for brilliance in the traditional sense, not a blazing intellect who leapt ahead of his peers, but he possessed something that might be called a merchant's curiosity, an almost physical need to understand how things were organized, how they were priced, how they moved from one hand to another. He would wander through shops near campus, not as a customer, but as a student of human behavior, noticing which items sat in windows, which were hidden in the back, how prices were marked and why. The war interrupted his path, as it interrupted so many lives, but it was what came after the war, in 1945, that truly shaped the man he would become. Sam took a job as a management trainee at J.C. Penney in Des Moines, and this decision, quiet and deliberate as it was, proved to be his real education. J.C. Penney was not a discount store in those early post-war years. It was a place of order, of careful merchandising, of quality merchandise displayed with precision. The company had a philosophy, one that permeated every inch of every store, and that philosophy was this: that retail was not simply about moving goods, but about building trust. Can you imagine what it might have felt like, stepping into a store where everything, the way the fabric was folded, the way the price was marked, the way a clerk greeted you, communicated respect for the customer? Sam threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even his supervisors. He learned how to read inventory, how to understand which items turned over quickly and which sat gathering dust. He studied pricing not as an abstract exercise, but as an art form, understanding that a price point was a conversation between merchant and customer. He would linger in the aisles after his shift ended, watching how people moved through the store, which displays caught their eye, which products they actually purchased. His colleagues noticed that he seemed to be doing this not out of ambition, but out of something closer to hunger, a genuine desire to understand the architecture of retail. The discipline that J.C. Penney demanded became part of his bones. Every morning began with cleanliness, with precision, with a certain austere beauty in the way merchandise was displayed. There was no clutter, no excess. Everything had its place, and everything was priced with fairness in mind. This was not the world of sharp dealing or hidden markups. The founder, James Cash Penney himself, had built his company on a principle he called the Golden Rule, and though the man himself was long since passed, his philosophy still moved through the stores like a current. Treat the customer as you would wish to be treated. Mark your goods fairly. Build relationships that might span decades, not transactions that lasted minutes. It was during these quiet years at J.C. Penney, working in a store where every shoelace and bolt of cotton was arranged with care, that Sam Walton began to develop the unusual hybrid philosophy that would define his later life. He absorbed, almost without knowing it, the Penney devotion to honest pricing and courteous service. But even as he worked, he was asking himself questions that his supervisors perhaps were not asking. What if the markup could be lower? What if the store could be more efficient? What if courtesy could be combined with something else entirely, with an almost radical simplicity in how goods were offered to people? He was, in essence, taking the lessons of discipline and reorganizing them in his mind, turning them slightly, looking at them from an angle that had not yet been fully explored. The experience lasted only a handful of years before the restlessness that had always moved beneath his quiet exterior began to surface again. But in that time, he had learned things that could not be unlearned. The importance of reading people, of understanding the subtle mathematics of what makes a store function, of the profound connection between how you treat a customer and whether they return. These were not revolutionary ideas in 1945, but they were foundational, and Sam had absorbed them so thoroughly that they would become the bedrock of everything he built. The question that began to form, slowly and without urgency, was simply this: if you took all of this careful discipline and fairness, and applied it not to expensive goods in cities, but to the ordinary necessities of life in small towns that no one was really paying attention to, what might happen then? The world that Sam Walton returned to in 1945 was not entirely the same world he had left. The Depression had lifted, yes, and the war effort had pulled America out of its deepest economic darkness. But something had shifted in the American character during those 5 years. There was a restlessness in the air, a hunger for things that had been denied, a sense that the future might be written differently than the past had suggested. Sam had served as an officer in the Army Signal Corps, stationed largely in the Pacific Theater, and while the war years had been formative in their own way, teaching him discipline, logistics, the movement of supplies across vast distances, the weight of small decisions that rippled outward, they had also made one thing abundantly clear. He did not wish to spend his life following someone else's orders. The GI Bill opened doors to education and opportunity, but Sam's ambitions had already begun to crystallize into something more specific and grounded. He wanted to build something of his own. This impulse was not uncommon among returning soldiers. The economy was swelling with pent-up demand, with young men eager to stake claims in their own futures. But in Sam Walton, this restlessness carried a particular quality. It was not the hunger for grandeur or for escaping small-town life altogether. Rather, it was a recognition that his skills, his eye for value, his understanding of human nature in commerce, his almost intuitive grasp of what people wanted to buy and what they would pay, might be better applied if he were the one setting the terms. Working for J.C. Penney had been an education, and he had risen competently through its ranks. But he had watched his own boss, the store manager above him, and understood that there were limits to how far ambition could carry you if you were always taking direction from distant corporate offices. The practical question that faced him was not whether to start a business, but what kind of business and where. His wife Helen, whom he had married before shipping out, became his closest counsel in these deliberations. Helen Robson came from a family of means. Her father was a banker, and she possessed a steadiness of temperament that balanced Sam's more restless nature. She did not push him towards safety or convention. Instead, she seemed to understand that this quiet restlessness of his was not a flaw to be managed, but a genuine orientation toward building something meaningful. What sort of store, then, could a young man with limited capital but considerable retail knowledge open in post-war America? The answer, when it came, was not revolutionary. It was, in fact, quite ordinary. The Ben Franklin franchise model existed, a wholesaler that supplied small independent retailers with merchandise and allowed them to operate under a recognized brand. This was how small towns across America stocked their general stores and variety shops. It required a modest initial investment compared to starting entirely from scratch. It provided a supply chain and a name that customers would recognize. And it offered a young man the chance to be his own boss while still benefiting from the support of a larger operation. In 1945, Sam Walton opened his first Ben Franklin store in Newport, Arkansas. Newport was a town of modest size, unremarkable in most respects, located in Jackson County in the north-central part of the state. It was the kind of place that most ambitious people of that era would have been eager to leave. For Sam, it was precisely where he needed to be. He was 30 years old, he had a wife, a modest amount of capital, and an idea that had not yet taken any form beyond the daily work of opening a store, arranging merchandise, and learning what the people of Newport wanted to buy. What happened in that store, however, was the beginning of something that Sam would spend the rest of his life refining and expanding. He did not simply stock shelves with merchandise supplied by Ben Franklin and wait for customers to arrive. He studied his competitors with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. He would drive through neighboring towns and walk the aisles of other variety stores, noting what was priced at what, observing which items seemed to move quickly and which lingered on shelves. He paid attention to the details that larger retailers overlooked, the way merchandise was displayed, the cleanliness of the store, the courtesy with which customers were greeted. He understood, perhaps before many others articulated it clearly, that retail was not simply about having goods available. It was about understanding the texture of daily life in a small town, and making that store the place where people naturally went because it treated them well and gave them value. His pricing philosophy began to crystallize during these early years, though it would take decades to fully develop. The conventional wisdom of retail at that time was that stores should mark merchandise up substantially, creating a wide margin between wholesale cost and retail price. This was how most retailers built their profits. But Sam began to wonder, quietly at first, what would happen if you operated on thinner margins, lower prices, and relied instead on volume, on the idea that more customers would come more frequently if they knew they were getting genuine value. It was an intuition born not from market theory, but from his understanding of small-town economics. People in rural Arkansas did not have much discretionary income. If you could offer them genuine savings, they would respond. They would tell their neighbors. They would become loyal to the store that gave them the best value. This philosophy would become, in time, the foundation of everything that followed. But in 1945, in a modest Ben Franklin store in Newport, it was simply the quiet attention of a young man who was learning his trade. He was learning not from business school or from the strategic papers of distant executives, but from watching human behavior, from noting what worked and what did not, from the daily practice of trying to run his store better than it had been run before. This was the real education that Sam Walton was receiving, and it would prove far more valuable than any degree or corporate training could have provided. By 1945, with the war behind him and a young wife named Helen, whom he'd married just before shipping out, Sam Walton found himself back in the civilian world with a clear and almost burning sense of what he wanted: his own store. Not a manager's position at someone else's enterprise, not a steady paycheck managing merchandise for a distant corporation, but something that would be entirely his. The restlessness that had carried him through military service didn't fade when he hung up his uniform. If anything, it intensified. He was 27 years old, lean, alert, with a wife who shared his quiet determination, and a mind already turning over the mechanics of retail like a man studying the inner workings of a clock. The opportunity arrived through a connection, one of those gentle accidents that would come to define his life. Someone knew of a Ben Franklin variety store franchise available for purchase in Newport, Arkansas, a town even smaller than the communities where his family had lived during his childhood. It was a Depression-era franchise model, still viable, still proven in small towns where five-and-dime stores represented a kind of municipal gathering place. The store was being offered for sale, and though the capital required was substantial, $15,000, a sum that demanded every penny he and Helen had managed to save or borrow, It felt like an open door. Sam walked through it without hesitation. What's worth noting, what becomes almost fascinating when you examine the early months and years in that Newport store, is how thoroughly and methodically he approached the simple problem of making it succeed. To most observers, he was simply running a variety store, doing what hundreds of other franchisees did across small-town America. But Sam's mind worked differently. He approached the store not as an end in itself, but as a kind of laboratory where every detail could be studied, tested, and refined. The layout of the aisles, the placement of merchandise, the psychology of how customers moved through the space, the precise mechanics of pricing and markup. He developed, almost without realizing he was doing it, an habit that would remain with him for the rest of his life, a kind of vigilant, almost obsessive observation. He would visit competitors' stores regularly, studying their approach not with envy or resentment, but with the focused attention of someone taking notes for an examination he hadn't yet been told he'd have to take. He noticed how J.C. Penney arranged their displays. He observed the way other variety stores priced items. He watched how customers behaved, where they lingered, what caught their eye. He wasn't being dishonest or deceptive. He was simply being curious in a way that most people aren't. Or perhaps more accurately, he was curious in a way that most people stop being once they've settled into their daily routines. His competitors' pricing systems fascinated him. At the time, many small retailers operated on the principle of high markups on individual items, the assumption being that a small town had nowhere else to go, so prices could simply be set higher. Sam began to ask himself whether the opposite might be true. What if, instead, you lowered prices substantially, but sold so much more volume that you actually made more profit overall? It was not revolutionary thinking in the abstract. Discount retailers existed, certainly, but in the context of small-town Arkansas, where the five and dime was supposed to be profitable precisely because it had a captive market, it was a genuinely radical notion. He began experimenting. He lowered prices on specific items, sometimes dramatically. He watched to see what happened. And what happened, in those early experiments in Newport, was that volume increased. Customers came more often. They bought more. Word traveled through the small community. There was something about the store that felt different, that felt fairer, that felt like it was thinking about the customer's wallet rather than just extracting whatever could be extracted. The profit margins on individual items might be smaller, but the overall picture brightened. Helen observed all of this. She was in the store constantly, often working alongside Sam, and she understood not just his ideas but his temperament, the way he seemed incapable of sitting still with conventional wisdom, the way he questioned everything, not out of arrogance, but out of a genuine need to understand how things actually worked. They moved into an apartment above the store, as was common in those days, which meant the store was never truly closed, never truly distant from their daily life. It was part of their existence. Yet for all this meticulous attention, for all the innovation in pricing and volume, the Newport store ultimately couldn't be what Sam was building it toward. The lease was landlord's property, not his. The building belonged to someone else, and when the lease came up for renewal, the landlord decided to raise the rent substantially, understanding perhaps that the store had become more valuable now that it was running well. The story has been told and retold, sometimes with different specific details, but the essential truth remains. Sam lost the lease. He fought it, perhaps, or accepted it with that practical stoicism that seemed to run through his family, but the outcome was that after about 5 years, he was no longer able to continue in Newport. Most people in that situation might have felt defeat keenly. They might have questioned whether the retail business was right for them at all. But something in Sam's character, something that had been visible since childhood, prevented that kind of despondency from taking root. Instead, what he felt was validated. His methods had worked. He had increased the store's profitability. He had proven something, at least to himself, about what was possible when you approached retail differently. What he didn't have was security. He didn't own the building. He couldn't control his own future in the way he wanted to control it. He began to wonder then, what would happen if he had both things, both the method he'd developed and the security that came with ownership? It was a question that would eventually lead him and Helen, with their small daughter and whatever capital they could gather from the loss of the store and their savings, toward a new town. Bentonville was waiting, though he didn't know it yet. The first genuine Walmart, the store that would bear his name and eventually reshape American retail, was still years away. But something was crystallizing in his mind, something that those 5 years studying aisles and prices and customer behavior had clarified into almost perfect clarity. And so Sam and Helen Walton had built something genuine in Newport. The Ben Franklin store had become a small world unto itself, a place where the inventory was arranged with almost monastic care, where the customers recognized the young couple behind the counter, where the rhythms of small-town retail had begun to feel like home. For 5 years, from 1945 onward, they had poured everything into that storefront, not just money, but attention, the kind of daily presence that binds a merchant to a community. Sam would walk the aisles in those quiet morning hours, noticing how competing stores displayed their wares, what items moved fastest, which price points made customers pause or reach. Helen managed the home above the store with their growing family, and between them they had woven themselves into the fabric of Newport's daily commerce. It must have felt, in those moments between inventory and supper, as though this was the shape their life would take. But commercial leases in small towns often carried a fragility that the proprietor's hard work could not overcome. The building itself was not theirs. The landlord held the power of renewal or refusal, and in 1950, as Sam's lease approached its end, the landlord declined to extend it. The reasons, as these things often unfold in small towns, were quiet and final. Perhaps the landlord had other plans for the building. Perhaps he felt he could secure a more profitable arrangement elsewhere. The historical record is sparse on the exact particulars, but the effect was absolute. After 5 years of meticulous work, of customer relationships cultivated with genuine care, of nights spent studying how to undercut competitors while maintaining margins, Sam and Helen Walton found themselves without a store. It is worth pausing here to feel the weight of that moment. Losing a lease is not like a bankruptcy filed in visible court documents. It is a private unraveling, a door that quietly closes. Sam had no legal recourse. He did not own the building. He had built the business, yes, but the foundation beneath it was rented ground, and rented ground can be taken away. The inventory remained his. The skills he had developed remained his, but the place itself, the corner where his customers knew to find him, evaporated into someone else's future plans. What might have followed was bitterness, or resignation, or a slow retreat into the security of working for another man's company. The temptation toward stability would have been real. Helen had children to think of. The depression had ended, but its lesson lingered. Security mattered. A paycheck mattered. A pension mattered. Why risk again? Why build again on rented ground? Yet something in Sam's nature resisted that surrender. He was 32 years old, and he had tasted the peculiar satisfaction of answering to no one but himself, of making decisions that rippled outward into the town's commercial life. The loss of the Newport store was devastating in its immediacy, but it was not, as it turned out, fatal to his ambition. Rather, it was a pivot point, and pivots, when one survives them, often carry a person toward destinations they could not have anticipated. This is where Helen's steadiness becomes crucial to the story, though it often goes unremarked. A wife could have counseled caution, could have asked her husband to find safe employment, to stop gambling their family's security on the thin margins of small-town retail. The historical record suggests Helen did not do this. She had, by most accounts, become a true partner in the enterprise, not merely the wife of an ambitious man, but someone who understood his vision and shared in the daily work of bringing it to life. When Newport fell away, when that building no longer belonged to them, Helen appears to have asked not whether they should continue, but where they should go next. The answer came as an offer, or perhaps more accurately, as an opportunity that Sam's reputation had created. There was a Woolworth's variety store in Bentonville, Arkansas, a town even smaller than Newport, perhaps 30 miles away. The store was struggling. The current operator was willing to sell, or to make an arrangement by which Sam could acquire it. The exact terms are lost to time, but the essential fact remains. There was a door open in Bentonville, and Sam and Helen walked through it. They left Newport without ownership, without a building they could call their own, with nothing but what they had learned and the determination to learn more. Bentonville in 1950 was a sleepy Ozark town, the kind of place where the courthouse square served as the social and commercial heart, where everybody knew everybody, where a stranger was both an oddity and a potential customer. It had perhaps 3,000 people. It had no reason to imagine it would become anything other than what it was. There were no prophets in Bentonville who could have foreseen that a man arriving with his wife and children and a second-hand understanding of variety retail would reshape not just the town, but the entire landscape of American commerce. How could anyone have known? Sam and Helen Walton stepped into Bentonville as people reinventing themselves, as merchants starting over after loss, carrying resilience like a quiet inheritance. They had been knocked down, and they had stood up. They had learned that rented ground is uncertain ground, but they had not learned defeat. The lesson of Newport was not that ambition was foolish. The lesson was something quieter and more durable, that if you build something real, something that serves people, something that is organized around genuine service and not just profit, then even when you lose the building, you do not lose the architecture of your own mind. And in Bentonville, on the courthouse square, Sam Walton would finally build something that would not be taken away. The morning of July 10th, 1962, broke over Bentonville, Arkansas, with the kind of ordinary stillness that would have meant nothing to almost anyone passing through. But for Sam Walton, now in his early 40s, standing outside a nondescript building on the corner of Cherrywood Road and Main Street, this was the moment where every quiet discipline, every notebook filled with competitor observations, every conversation with merchants and customers across the Ozarks had been gathering, waiting to release itself into something entirely new. The storefront was modest, perhaps 5,000 square feet of space in what had been an old Woolworth's building, the kind of structure that had served small-town commerce for decades without fanfare or distinction. There was nothing glamorous about the architecture or the setting. Bentonville itself was a place of maybe 6,000 people, agricultural, unhurried, the sort of town where most retail experts wouldn't have seen much promise at all. Yet Sam had chosen here, after the loss of the Newport store had taught him a crucial and painful lesson about ownership. He had learned, in the aftermath of that heartbreak, that he wanted to own not just the merchandise and the operation, but the building itself, the land beneath his feet. He and Helen had saved, had borrowed carefully, and had acquired property in Bentonville where he could build something with deeper roots. And so, on this ordinary July morning, Walmart opened its doors for the first time, and the gamble that would reshape American retail had begun, though no one standing in that modest space could have known the scale of what they were beginning. The hand-painted signs in the window were Sam's own work, or at least bore his direct instruction and his penny-conscious sensibility. Bright yellow letters on simple cardboard announced the revolutionary promise: prices lower than anywhere around them. Not fancy script, not the polished commercial signage you might have seen in the windows of department stores in Little Rock or other cities. These were the signs of someone who understood that paint and cardboard cost money, and that money saved on signage was money that could be passed to customers in the form of lower prices. Every decision in those early hours and days reflected the philosophy that would define the company. Waste nothing, cut everything, that didn't directly serve the customer's pocket. The inventory was carefully selected, perhaps predictably for someone who had spent years learning what small-town customers actually needed and wanted. Dry goods, basic clothing, simple household necessities, hardware and tools, school supplies, the kinds of things that families in Bentonville and the surrounding rural communities bought regularly, week after week. There were no pretensions here, no attempt to offer something fancy or exclusive. This was retail stripped down to its essential purpose, connecting people with goods they wanted at prices they could afford. Some merchandise came from relationships Sam had built with suppliers over his years in retail, people who had come to respect his honesty and his ability to move volume, even in small towns. The opening day itself was quiet. No grand ceremony, no crowds that spilled into the street or generated local newspaper headlines that would be remembered decades later. A modest flow of customers came through the doors, curious about this new store with its unusual promise, skeptical perhaps, as small-town people often are about radical claims. But they came, and they bought, and they noticed that the prices were indeed lower than what they'd been paying elsewhere. They noticed that the store was clean and organized, that merchandise was easy to find, that there was a kind of clarity and order to how things were arranged. Was this revolutionary? No, but it was distinct. It was different from the cluttered, dimly lit general stores, or the more formal, cushioned atmosphere of established retailers. The real gamble, the thing that separated Sam's thinking from conventional retail wisdom of the time, lay in the underlying economics that almost no one else had understood. Large retailers, the chains that dominated American commerce in the early 1960s, were focused on urban centers and suburban areas where density was high and populations were growing. They had built their empires on the assumption that you found customers in cities and towns of significant size. The small towns of rural Arkansas, the villages scattered across Oklahoma and Missouri and East Texas, the agricultural communities that were slowly depopulating as mechanization reduced the need for farm labor. These were considered marginal markets, places where profit margins had to be protected because volume would be low. Sam, by contrast, had spent years watching these small towns, driving through them, talking to their residents, understanding their economic lives. He had observed that while individual towns might be small, they weren't truly isolated in the way they had been 50 years earlier. Better roads were connecting them. A reasonable drive could connect a customer to other towns nearby. What if you could create a store that was so much cheaper than anything else available that people would willingly drive a little further or shift their shopping habits? What if you could build a supply chain that was efficient enough to operate on such thin profit margins that you could undercut every competitor, even the great chains, and still survive? This was the theoretical foundation. The Bentonville store was the experiment, the first physical testing ground for an idea that seemed almost dangerously optimistic. The discount retail concept itself wasn't entirely new. Kmart had been founded a few years earlier, and there were other discounters operating in larger markets. But Sam's insight, the thing he had been quietly synthesizing through his years of observation, was that discount retailing could work not in the places where conventional retailers had already gone, but precisely in the places they had overlooked and abandoned. The small towns weren't a handicap, they were an advantage, because there was no established competitor structure to fight, no powerful retail establishments that could respond with their own price cuts. In the first year, the Bentonville Walmart generated something like $800,000 in sales, a solid performance, but hardly breathtaking by the standards of the retail world. What mattered more was the principle that had worked. Customers came. They bought regularly. The prices were low enough to draw them in, and the efficiency of the operation was high enough that the business was profitable. There was no grand revelation, no moment where everyone around Sam suddenly understood that they were witnessing the birth of something that would grow to transform American consumer life. It was simply a store that worked, a proof of concept, a small light in Bentonville that had vindicated an intuition born of 100 notebooks filled with observations about what people wanted and what competing retailers were doing wrong. Helen was there through this opening, as she had been through the Newport store's rise and fall. She understood the stakes in a way that perhaps only someone so close to the work, so invested in both the emotional and financial dimensions of the enterprise, could understand. For her, it wasn't just about building a business, it was about building something that would sustain their family and reflect their values: thrift, honesty, care for the customer, respect for the work itself. The modest opening of that first Walmart store in 1962 was, in a quiet way, the moment when the possibility that had been alive in Sam's imagination began to become real, to take on weight and dimension in the material world. The hand-painted signs eventually came down, replaced by more professional signage as the company grew and resources allowed. The original storefront became one location among thousands, but the principle that had guided those first signs, that every penny saved should benefit the customer, remained woven into the company's DNA. The gamble of discount retailing in small towns, which seemed so uncertain on that July morning in 1962, proved to be not a gamble at all, but rather an insight so clear and so simple that it had been nearly invisible to everyone who came before it. Sam Walton had looked at a map of rural America, had listened to conversations and observed pricing practices, and had seen something that the entire established retail industry had missed: a vast opportunity in the places where opportunity was thought to be scarce. There is something almost meditative about the simplicity of an idea, the way a true insight can emerge not from complexity, but from paying close attention to what others have overlooked. And this is what Sam Walton saw, as he stood in that first modest store on Bentonville's Main Street in the summer of 1962, that most of the American retail establishment had made a fundamental assumption about small towns and rural America. They assumed these places could not sustain the kind of volume and thin margin selling that made large stores work in cities. Department stores and traditional variety retailers believed profit required expensive real estate, high inventory turnover in dense urban cores, and customers who had learned to expect selection at whatever price the market would bear. Sam saw something different entirely. The philosophy he began to crystallize, the one that would eventually define Walmart, rested on what might seem like an obvious insight, but was genuinely radical for its time: that if you could lower your profit margin per item dramatically, and if you could move that inventory with astonishing speed and efficiency, then you could sell vastly more goods overall, making up in volume what you surrendered in individual markup. It was not a new mathematical principle. Discount retailing had been theorized before, but few large retailers had the discipline or the courage to truly embrace it in practice. Sam did. He called it everyday low prices, and the phrase, deceptively simple as it was, contained within it an entire reimagining of how commerce could work in forgotten corners of America. But here is the deeper truth that made this philosophy not just plausible but inevitable to Sam's success. The geography itself was his advantage. While mainstream retailers dismissed small towns as too sparse in population, too dispersed in settlement pattern, too poor in purchasing power to justify the investment, Sam recognized that these same qualities created an opening. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of small towns across the American South and the rural Midwest that had never been properly served by efficient, affordable retail. The local variety store was often run by an owner who needed to maintain high markups just to survive. The nearest real discount operation might be 30, 40, 50 miles away in a regional hub. Families in these towns either paid premium prices locally or invested hours driving to larger cities. What if, Sam began to reason, you could build a store that served not just the small town itself, but the entire rural region around it? What if you sited your store where land was cheap, where there was no competition from established retailers who saw no profit opportunity, where driving distance was actually manageable for farm families and rural workers? You could offer prices they simply could not find anywhere else. You could become, almost by default, the destination. And because you were building on cheap land, with lower labor costs, lower rent, and lower overhead than a city store, you could afford those thin margins. You could afford to sell a can of beans for a penny less than your competitor and still survive. This was not cynical. It was not predatory in the way Sam conceived it. It was, in his thinking, almost an act of service. He genuinely believed that rural Americans deserved access to affordable goods just as urban consumers did. He believed, and there is a gentle idealism in this, worth sitting with, that by bringing efficient, low-cost retail to places that had been ignored, he was democratizing access to goods that many families struggled to afford. Every penny saved on a weekly grocery trip meant something. It meant a child could have new shoes sooner. It meant a family could stretch their budget a little further. Sam had grown up watching his own family navigate scarcity. He understood viscerally what small savings meant when you lived close to the margins. The culture of cost consciousness that ran through Walmart from the earliest days was not theater. Sam was genuinely obsessed with efficiency, with rooting out waste, with finding ways to do things for less money, without diminishing the product itself. He would walk store aisles, sometimes late into the evening, studying shelf layouts and thinking about how to reduce the time it took a customer to find what they needed. He would visit competitor stores in other towns, notebook in hand, sketching their arrangements, noting their prices, analyzing their operations like a naturalist studying an unfamiliar ecosystem. This was not espionage exactly. It was simply serious homework. He was trying to learn every lever of retail efficiency so that he could pull the most effective combination. And there was something almost spatial, something to do with how the human eye moves through space and how goods can be arranged for maximum accessibility and impulse appeal, that Sam seemed to understand intuitively. Think about the architecture of a small-town variety store before Walmart. Goods were often tucked away, organized in ways that made sense to the owner, but not necessarily to the customer. You had to ask for things. You had to know where to look. Sam began to think about his stores as spaces where goods were not hidden but displayed, where everything was visible and easy to reach, where the customer's journey through the store was almost choreographed to ease the process of shopping. This was efficiency in service of customer convenience. It was philosophy made tangible. The rural geography also gave Sam something else: flexibility. Because his stores were not in prime urban locations, he was not locked into the high-stakes real estate calculations that bound urban retailers. He could experiment. He could fail in a small town without the capital loss being catastrophic. He could try a new layout, a new pricing strategy, a new category of goods, and if it did not work, it was a manageable setback. But if it did work, he could replicate it across dozens of similar small towns. This was capital learning purchased cheaply, distributed widely. A city retailer making a strategic mistake in an expensive downtown location paid a different price entirely. There is a question worth contemplating in the quietness of this moment. What if Sam Walton had believed, as most of his contemporaries did, that the American retail future belonged to big cities and expensive real estate? What if he had thought the small-town store was quaint and doomed, a relic? He would have been wrong, and his company would never have existed. Instead, by taking seriously the places others ignored, by seeing not limitation but possibility in rural geography, He found an entire continent of customers who had been waiting, unknowingly, for someone to bring them the goods they needed at prices they could afford. And in doing so, he began to reshape not just retail, but the entire texture of rural American life. By the early 1960s, Sam Walton had begun to understand something that most retail men of his era had not yet glimpsed, that the future of American commerce would not belong to the cities, but to the in-between places. The small towns that existed in the gentle folds of Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. Places where 3,000 people might gather on Saturday mornings to shop, where a store could become not just a destination, but the beating heart of local life. This insight was not born from theory or boardroom analysis, but from something far simpler, from watching, from driving, from stopping at crossroads and talking to people and understanding what they needed. In those early years, after that first Walmart opened in Bentonville, expansion was not frantic or chaotic. It was methodical, deliberate. Sam would identify a town, often by studying maps in a way that seemed almost obsessive to those around him, looking for communities of the right size, not too small to sustain a store, not large enough to have already been claimed by larger competitors. 5,000 people, 7,000, 10,000, towns with names like Fayetteville and Springdale, like Mount Ida and Ozark, towns where people shopped at family stores that had operated the same way for decades, where the idea of discount pricing still seemed almost radical, almost impossible to square with quality. What set Sam apart, what would eventually determine the rhythm of Walmart's spread across the South, was something born partly from practical necessity and partly from a restless curiosity about the landscape itself. He bought a small airplane, a Piper Cub or later planes of similar modest size, and he learned to fly it himself. Picture this, a man in his early 50s, already successful, already wealthy by small-town standards, climbing into a fragile aircraft in the cool morning hours and lifting himself above the Ozark Plateau, looking down, seeing the roads that connected one town to another, the geography that determined where trucks could reach, where distribution made sense, where gaps existed in the retail map of the American South. This was not mere romance, though there was something romantic in it. It was strategy disguised as adventure. From the air, Sam could see patterns invisible from the ground. He could identify secondary markets before his competitors even knew they existed. He could spot a promising location and land on a small airstrip, sometimes on nothing more than a farmer's field, and walk the main street, talk to shopkeepers, understand the local economy in a way that no amount of census data could convey. He would return home with his observations, and the next store would open in that place, ready for a population that had been waiting, perhaps without knowing it, for the chance to buy good things at low prices. His pilots, and later his children when they learned to fly beside him, became accustomed to a certain pattern. Sam would sit in the cockpit, scanning the landscape, pointing downward when something caught his attention, a town that looked promising, a crossroads, a location where a new highway was being built. Sometimes he would circle a place 2 or 3 times, seeing it from different angles, the way a man might walk around a piece of furniture before deciding whether it would fit in his home. The decisions made in those moments, made from 500 feet above the earth, made with the intuition of someone who had spent his life learning how people lived, shaped which towns would receive Walmart stores and which would not. What strikes one about this method, looking back across the decades, is how personal it remained. The growth of Walmart, as it accelerated through the 1960s and into the 70s, was driven not by remote analysis or corporate committees alone, but by a man who was willing to spend his own time, his own attention, flying over his own country to understand it better. There was a kind of intimacy in it, even as the scale grew larger and more complex. Sam Walton was not a man who delegated the fundamental work of knowing where his stores should be. He did it himself. He saw it from above. He walked the streets. He spoke to the people. The expansion followed a pattern that began to reveal itself like a story unfolding across a map. The original store in Bentonville served as the hub. From there, stores began to populate the smaller towns within a day's drive, within the range of a truck that could make deliveries, within the reach of a distribution system that Sam was quietly building behind the scenes. This was not random scatter. It was a web, a network. Each store supported the others. Each town's location was chosen with reference to all the others, creating a density of presence in the South that larger, more established competitors had overlooked. By 1965, Walmart had 18 stores. By 1970, there were 84, spreading across Arkansas and into neighboring states like water finding its level. This growth was remarkable, not because it was the fastest anyone had ever seen. It was steady, sustainable, but because it worked. Because the stores were profitable. Because the people who shopped in these towns, who had grown accustomed to driving long distances for better prices or driving all the way to the city, could now walk down their own main street and find what they needed, priced lower than anyone had thought possible, in a store staffed by neighbors. And Sam, in his small plane, continued to scout, to see, to sense where the next store should go. It was as if he were writing the story of American retail on the landscape itself, one town at a time, and the airplane was simply the instrument that allowed him to read the geography more clearly, to see the patterns that others had missed. The Ozarks and the South were not obstacles or secondary markets to him. They were home, they were the future, and he could see it from above before anyone else had even looked up. What often remains quietly untold in the grand stories of American business is the invisible architecture built not in warehouses or on loading docks, but in the ordinary rooms of a family home. Sam Walton, for all his relentless energy and his habit of studying competitors' price tags with the intensity of a scholar, was never truly alone in this work. Behind him, steadying him, anticipating the needs of a growing empire that was beginning to stretch across state lines, was Helen Robson Walton. And as the children grew into young adulthood through the 1960s, the Walton household became something rather remarkable. A quiet laboratory where retail philosophy and family responsibility were not seen as separate things, but as deeply woven into one another. Helen had married Sam in 1943, and she brought with her a sensibility born partly from her father's substantial ranching and farming interests in Oklahoma. She was educated, composed, and possessed a kind of patient steel that balanced Sam's restlessness. While Sam was the constant motion, the early mornings, the endless studying, the way he would walk the floors of his competitors' stores with a notebook in hand, Helen was the still center. She understood the balance required to raise children while their father was building something that demanded ever more of his time and focus. And remarkably, she never framed this as sacrifice. The stories that filter down suggest she saw it as participation, a family project unfolding at its own pace. By the early 1960s, as that first Walmart opened in Bentonville, the Waltons had 5 children: Rob, the eldest, born in 1944, John, who followed in 1946, Jim, arriving in 1948, Alice, the only daughter, born in 1949, and Christine, the youngest, who came into the world in 1953. Helen's role during these years was less visible than Sam's, but perhaps more foundational. She was the one who created the conditions under which the children could understand their father's absence, not as rejection, but as purpose. She knew the business. She attended the early store openings. She understood the economics of discount retailing, not as an abstract concept, but as something that could feed her family and provide her children with opportunity. And as Sam's ambitions began to crystallize into something larger than a single store, Helen quietly began to prepare her children for roles they might one day play. The household in Bentonville was not lavish, though by the 1960s it was certainly comfortable. Helen managed it with the same attention to detail that Sam applied to inventory turnover. The children grew up watching both parents model a particular kind of discipline. Money earned was not frivolously spent. Time was precious and allocated carefully. Hard work was not something to complain about, but something to undertake with quiet dignity. This was not wealth displaying itself, but wealth building itself. There was something almost purposeful in the modesty, as if both Sam and Helen understood that excessive comfort in the present might weaken the character they were trying to develop in their children. Rob, the eldest, became the figure who most closely mirrored his father's temperament, ambitious, keen to understand the mechanics of the business, willing to dive into the details. By the late 1960s, as Walmart was beginning its methodical expansion across Arkansas and into neighboring states, Rob was moving into positions where he could observe and eventually participate in the strategic decisions. John, more inclined toward the financial and operational side of things, began to develop expertise in logistics and supply chain management, disciplines that would become increasingly critical as the company scaled. Jim showed early interest in the real estate aspects of expansion, understanding which towns could sustain a Walmart, which locations offered the right real estate terms, which communities had the demographic and economic profile to make a store viable. This was often less glamorous work than the public face of retail, but it was essential, and Alice, watching her three brothers carve out their particular domains, began to understand that her own path might differ, but that her role in the family enterprise could be equally substantive. Helen's particular gift during these years was her ability to hold the family's emotional and relational life together, while the business demanded ever more. There is something quietly moving in the historical record about the way she managed what might have been resentment. Sam's absences were real. His preoccupations were genuine. Yet Helen seems never to have made his business pursuits into a source of family tension. Instead, she modeled an approach to marriage and parenthood that suggested the business and the family and the household were all expressions of a coherent set of values. Work was not something that happened at the expense of family. It was something the family was, in some sense, doing together. The Saturday morning meetings at the Walmart headquarters, a practice Sam would continue well into his later years, became in some way a manifestation of this family integration. The managers and associates gathered to hear announcements, celebrate store successes, and receive direction. But Sam's children, as they came of age, began to appear at these gatherings. They were not shadowed visitors, but participants. They were learning the language of the business by listening to their father speak to his employees. They were observing how he inspired, how he communicated, how he balanced accountability with genuine care for the people who worked in the stores. It was a kind of extended education that no business school could quite replicate. By the end of the 1960s, as Walmart was approaching 300 stores and preparing itself for the step into the public markets, the Walton children were no longer simply the boss's kids who might someday inherit something. They were becoming identifiable presences in the organization, each with a particular sphere of competence and interest. Helen's steadiness had created space for this transition to unfold naturally. She had neither pushed them into the business nor insulated them from it. She had simply ensured that they grew up understanding it as the family's work and as something that could be undertaken with integrity and purpose. As the stores multiplied across Arkansas and then into Oklahoma and Missouri, something began to happen inside the fluorescent-lit aisles that surprised even some of Sam's earliest competitors. It wasn't just the prices, though those were undeniably low. It wasn't the inventory management systems, though those were ahead of their time. It was something quieter, something that moved through the stores like a steady current, and it had to do with how Sam Walton thought about the people who worked for him. In those early years, when a small-town merchant could still know the name of everyone on his payroll, Sam had cultivated a philosophy that would seem almost quaint in later decades, yet he held to it with the kind of conviction usually reserved for religious principle. He believed, quite simply and quite firmly, that a store was only as good as the morale of the people who kept its shelves stocked and its registers running, not profitable, not efficient in the narrow sense, but good. There was a difference, he seemed to understand, between a machine that merely functioned and a human enterprise that actually thrived. Every Saturday morning, before dawn broke across Bentonville, the managers and assistant managers and key employees of the Walmart stores would gather. These weren't formal corporate meetings in the manner of distant headquarters in distant cities. They were something more intimate, more alive. Sam would call them together in whatever space could hold them, and he would begin not with profit margins or quarterly targets, though those certainly came into the conversation. He would begin by asking his people what they had seen in their stores, what worked, what didn't, what a customer had said to them, what a competitor down the road was doing differently. The Saturday morning meetings became legendary in the company's lore, and there is something worth pausing on here. They became legendary because they were, in their way, an act of profound respect. In a time when large corporations kept their distance from the people who did the actual work of retail, Sam chose instead to create a space where a shelf stocker from a small store in rural Oklahoma could stand up and offer an idea, and that idea might be heard, truly heard, by the man building the empire. Is there something almost revolutionary in that simple openness? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was just good sense. Sam seemed to believe they were the same thing. He would walk through stores unannounced, which wasn't unusual for a founder, but the way he walked through them was. He didn't move through to inspect, though inspection certainly happened. He moved through as if he were genuinely curious, as if each store held secrets worth understanding. He would stop and talk to the people working the registers. He would ask them how they were treated, whether they felt the company cared about them, whether they could see themselves building a future in retail, and he would listen to their answers with a patience that suggested he already knew what he would find if he paid attention. The culture that began to develop in these stores had a particular character to it. There was what came to be called the Walmart cheer, a kind of spirited, almost playful affirmation that employees would do together, a gesture of collective energy and belonging. It might seem like a small thing now, a relic of an earlier era, yet it represented something Sam understood intuitively. People work better, work longer, take pride in their work, when they feel part of something larger than themselves, when they feel seen and valued. This wasn't altruism in the simple sense. Sam wasn't naive about the nature of business or the reality of profit and loss. But he had observed something that many of his contemporaries had not, or had chosen to ignore. He had observed that paying fair wages, treating people with consistency and respect, creating an environment where someone who worked hard and contributed ideas might actually see themselves rise through the ranks. That these things weren't luxuries added on top of profitability. They were, in his view, fundamental to profitability. A store where people cared, where they showed up not just because they needed a paycheck, but because they wanted to be there. That store would outperform a store where people were merely tolerated, merely used as the cheapest available labor. It's worth sitting with this for a moment, because it contradicts certain narratives that would come later. Sam Walton built something that succeeded, in part, because he was willing to share the success with the people who made it possible. Not equally, certainly. The wealth would concentrate as it always does in capitalism, but there was a genuine ethos of inclusion, of partnership, that ran through the early company culture. He offered stock options to employees at a time when that was nearly unheard of at the retail level. He spoke about profit sharing not as a distant corporate abstraction, but but as a practical reality. If the store did well, the people who worked in the store would benefit. Sam seemed to grasp something that takes many leaders years to understand, if they ever do. People work harder, think more creatively, stay longer, and remain loyal when the rewards of their effort flow back to them in tangible ways. The Saturday meetings continued to evolve as the company grew, becoming more formal in structure as necessity demanded, yet retaining something of their original spirit. Sam would share information with store managers that other retailers kept locked in executive boardrooms. He would explain the numbers, the strategy, the vision, as if the people in those rooms were partners in the enterprise rather than subordinates carrying out orders. And in doing so, he cultivated a class of middle managers and store leaders who felt invested in the company's success in ways that were personal, almost familial. There was a belief, too, that would become something of a Walton family conviction, that kindness in business, generosity in the treatment of employees, and the willingness to let people participate in the fruits of their labor, these weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of strength, of confidence, of a leader secure enough to recognize that his success depended entirely on the success of others. In a landscape dominated by harder-edged philosophies of management, this was peculiar. Perhaps it was even lonely in its own way. As the stores kept opening, as the machinery of growth began to accelerate beyond what any single man could oversee personally, Sam worked to ensure that something of this culture would be preserved and passed along. The Saturday morning meetings would continue, though now they would be replicated and scaled, adapted to new realities. But the underlying principle wouldn't change. The people who worked in Walmart stores were part of the family that was building this thing. They deserved to be treated that way. By the late 1960s, Walmart had grown into something that could no longer fit inside a family office ledger. The company operated more than 100 stores scattered across Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas. The expansion had been methodical, almost meditative in its pace, yet underneath that calm exterior ran a current of ambition that Sam Walton himself had quietly nurtured for nearly a decade. The question that began to occupy his thoughts, and the thoughts of Helen and the accountants gathered around their conference tables, was not whether the company could grow larger, but whether growth itself required a different kind of vessel to carry it forward. In the spring of 1970, Walmart held its initial public offering. It was not announced with fanfare or grand celebration, but rather with the understated gravity of a significant threshold being crossed. The company offered shares to the public, transforming itself from a private family enterprise into a publicly traded corporation. For the Walton family, this meant both liberation and constraint. Liberation came in the form of capital, the lifeblood needed to fund expansion into new regions at a pace that reinvested profits alone could never sustain. But constraint arrived as well, in the form of quarterly earnings calls and shareholder expectations, in the obligation to grow, not just steadily, but demonstrably, to justify the faith that strangers had placed in the company by purchasing its stock. Sam understood something about this transition that many founder-led businesses struggle to learn. The public offering was not, in his quiet way of thinking, a moment to abandon the philosophy that had built Walmart in the first place. Instead, it was an opportunity to scale that philosophy, to replicate it across dozens and then hundreds of stores, each one staffed by people who believed in the same fundamental idea, that the working people of rural America deserved access to inexpensive goods without having to travel to distant cities or pay premium prices in small-town monopolies. The public offering simply meant he now had the resources to pursue that vision with greater reach and speed. What happened in the years immediately following the offering was remarkable for its consistency. While other retail chains that went public often lost their original identity, becoming corporate and distant from their roots, Walmart remained stubbornly rooted in the sensibility of small-town culture. The Saturday morning meetings continued, though now they often included regional managers traveling from across multiple states. The meetings retained their quality of belonging, their assumption that everyone in the room, from the newest stock clerk to Sam himself, had ideas worth hearing. This was not sentiment. This was, in Sam's view, practical wisdom. A store manager in rural Kansas understood the needs of rural Kansas in ways that no distant corporate office ever could. The period between 1970 and 1975 saw Walmart open stores in Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia. Each new store followed a template, yet each one was adapted to its particular location. The discount model that had worked so powerfully in the Ozarks proved to have a curious universality. There were small towns throughout the American South and Southwest where people lived in circumstances similar to those Sam had studied so carefully, communities overlooked by major retailers, populations that had historically been served by local merchants who, whatever their merits, could not match the buying power of a large corporation. Walmart could undercut their prices without approaching the financial strain it would impose on a smaller competitor. This was not predatory in the sense of aggressive pricing wars, but it was undeniably transformative. Over time, the small independent retailers in these towns found their margins compressed, their customers drawn away by the promise of lower costs on the items families actually needed to buy each week. The question of what this meant, and whether it was just or troubling, or simply the inevitable movement of commerce, was one that society would begin to grapple with more openly as the decades unfolded. But in 1972, 1973, 1974, the prevailing sentiment in the towns where Walmart arrived was often gratitude. Walmart created jobs. It offered prices that made household budgets stretch further. It was clean and organized and open on Sundays in places where families had previously had limited shopping options. The notion that growth itself might carry costs that were distributed unevenly, that some people benefited while others absorbed losses, was a thought that would surface more insistently later, after the company had already become too large to ignore. Within the family itself, the shift to a public company meant something quieter and perhaps more complex. Sam remained firmly in control as chairman and chief executive, his vision still the guiding force. But the growth of the business required more sophisticated management structures, and the Walton children began to assume roles that were less about the entrepreneurial spark of discovery and more about the operational excellence of scaling something that already existed. Rob, the eldest son, took on responsibilities in merchandising and supply chain logistics. John, the middle son, worked in real estate and store operations. Jim, the youngest, brought his energy to information systems and distribution. Alice, the only daughter, carved a path that allowed her to remain somewhat apart from the day-to-day retail operations, developing interests in philanthropy and education that would become increasingly significant as the family's wealth accumulated. Helen, Sam's wife and the quiet anchor throughout all of this, continued to exercise her steady influence. Her role less visible than Sam's, but perhaps, in the long view of things, equally essential. The preservation of Walmart's small-town identity during this period of rapid expansion was achieved partly through deliberate cultural choices. The company remained headquartered in Bentonville, Arkansas. This was not a practical necessity. A more centralized location would have made logistical sense for a company expanding nationwide. But it was a symbolic commitment to the place where the company had been born, to the region that had made it possible. The distribution centers that fed the growing network of stores were built in small towns rather than major metropolitan areas. The suppliers that Walmart worked with were encouraged, sometimes required, to understand that the company's prices were set with the assumption that they, too, would operate with extraordinary efficiency and accept modest margins. In doing so, Walmart began to reshape not just retail, but the entire ecosystem of supply, logistics, and employment that supported it. By 1975, 5 years after the public offering, Walmart operated more than 400 stores. The number itself had a kind of quiet weight to it. 400 individual communities now had a Walmart. 400 places where people came to shop on Saturday mornings or after work on Thursdays. 400 gathering points in the fabric of American small-town life, each one a physical manifestation of Sam Walton's belief that ordinary people deserved access to low prices as a basic right, not a luxury reserved for city dwellers. Yet, even as those Saturday morning meetings filled the stores with energy and purpose, a quieter, more difficult story was unfolding in the small towns where Walmart had begun to take root. The very philosophy that had made Sam Walton's stores so appealing to rural customers, those everyday low prices, the abundance of goods under one roof, the convenience of a single trip instead of visiting 5 different shops, was beginning to reshape the economic landscape in ways that were neither simple nor painless. In towns across Arkansas and Oklahoma and Missouri, men and women who had owned general stores and clothing shops and hardware outlets for decades found themselves facing a choice that felt less like a choice at all. A customer who had come to their counter for 40 years, who knew their children's names, who had extended credit during lean seasons, was now driving to the newer, brighter Walmart on the edge of town, where prices were lower and the selection was vast. The personal relationship, which had once been the lifeblood of small retail, suddenly seemed like a luxury that fewer people could afford. Sam Walton himself was not unaware of this tension. Those who knew him in those years speak of a man who understood the mathematics of displacement, who could see in a ledger what the expansion meant, not just for his own company, but for the fabric of the communities around him. Yet he also believed, and perhaps this is where the complexity truly lies, that he was serving a larger good. The people of these small towns were, in his view, the beneficiaries of lower prices. A family that could stretch their paycheck further, that could buy more of what they needed without traveling to distant cities, was living with a kind of dignity and abundance that had been unavailable to them before. There is something worth pausing on here, in the stillness of this contradiction. Both things were true. The prices were genuinely lower, families did save money, and yet the man who had owned the Five and Dime on Main Street for 20 years was closing his doors. The baker whose shop had anchored the corner for a generation was selling the building to a real estate developer. These were not abstract economic forces at work. They were the lives of neighbors, the erosion of a particular kind of community fabric, the loss of gathering places where commerce was inseparable from conversation. Some historians have suggested, quietly, that Sam Walton's personal humility and his genuine care for his employees may have made this particular irony harder for him to confront. He was not a man who viewed himself as a ruthless businessman dismantling tradition. He saw himself as an innovator, a democratizer, making abundance available to people who had never had it. And in a sense, he was. But innovation and disruption are always siblings, and one does not come without the other. The local merchants themselves were not uniformly critical, which adds another layer to the remembrance of this time. Some recognized what was coming and chose to sell their inventory to Walmart, or to work in a department within the new stores, adapting rather than resisting. Others attempted to compete by offering more personalized service, by becoming specialty retailers who did one thing exceptionally well in a way that the broad-based discount store could not match. A few towns managed this transition with enough grace that local business culture survived in altered form. But in many places, the main streets did hollow out. The social texture of downtown, the web of relationships that had sustained communities through hard times, unraveled slowly and then all at once. By the 1980s, as Walmart's reach extended into more remote regions, photographs from these towns show block after block of empty storefronts, the paint peeling from doors that no longer opened for business. It became a visual symbol of a change that no one had quite anticipated when a pickup truck first parked in a small-town lot with a sign promising lower prices. What makes this moment in the Walmart story neither wholly villainous nor wholly triumphant is precisely that it was driven not by malice but by the relentless logic of capitalism and consumer preference. The markets opened themselves to his vision because customers, making rational decisions about their own family's budgets, chose the lower prices. And yet that choice, multiplied across millions of transactions, had consequences that rippled far beyond the transaction itself. The question that lingers in the archives, in the interviews with people who lived through it, is whether there might have been another way forward. Could rapid growth and the preservation of local retail have coexisted? Was there a version of the Walmart story in which small merchants found protection or partnership rather than displacement? Or was the transformation simply the inevitable cost of moving into a new era of commerce, the price that had to be paid for the abundance that followed? These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps that is why they still resonate in the quiet of small towns across America. Sam Walton himself, in his final years, would sometimes speak in interviews about his respect for those old merchants, acknowledging a kind of melancholy about what had changed. Whether that acknowledgement constituted true reckoning or a way of honoring the past while remaining committed to the future remains, in many ways, a matter of interpretation and perspective. What is clear, in the documentary record and in the memories of those who lived through it, is that the Walton family's ascent was not uncomplicated. It was not a story of purely heroic innovation. It was a story, like many stories of enormous wealth creation, in which genuine good and genuine harm moved forward together, and in which one person's democratization of commerce was another person's loss of livelihood. The history of great fortunes often contains these shadows, and to understand the Walton legacy fully is to hold both the light and the shadow at the same time, without looking away from either. By the 1980s, Sam Walton had become something few self-made American businessmen had managed to remain: a quiet man in his own kingdom. The Walmart empire, which he had built methodically from that first 5,000-square-foot store in Bentonville, had grown into something that no spreadsheet from 1962 could have predicted. Thousands of stores now bore the blue and white name across the map. Billions of dollars had flowed through the family's hands, and yet, if you had encountered Sam Walton in those later years, walking through one of his stores on a Saturday morning, you might not have known you were in the presence of one of the wealthiest men alive. This was not accident or affectation. It was something far more deliberate and, in its own way, far more remarkable. As his health began its slow, patient decline in the late 1980s, Sam maintained a habit that had never changed since those early days of driving between Newport and Bentonville in his pickup, studying competitors' windows. He still visited stores, not from any boardroom obligation, but from what seemed like a genuine hunger to be among the aisles, among the customers, among the people who worked beneath the fluorescent lights every single day. No entourage, no announcement that the founder had arrived. He would simply walk in, often dressed in a plain shirt that bore the Walmart logo, something any associate might wear, and he would move through the store as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had occupied him for 50 years. What was he looking for, these associates might have wondered, if they had known who he was? He was looking, it seems, for inefficiency, for a price that had drifted too high, for a display that could be merchandised more thoughtfully, for a customer who seemed lost or uncertain, for an employee who might be struggling, who might need a word of encouragement or a small gesture of recognition. He would stop and chat. He would ask questions. And what strikes us now, from the vantage of decades, is that these visits were not acts of inspection or judgment. They were more like acts of listening, as if Sam Walton, even at the height of his influence, believed that the truth of his company existed in those mundane moments, in the actual work, the actual service, the actual encounter between human beings across a counter. There is a quality that certain founders possess, a restlessness that wealth and success never quite quiets. They keep moving because perhaps sitting still would mean confronting the question of why they moved at all. Was it the money? Was it the power? Or was it something else? Something about the simple satisfaction of making things work, of solving problems, of making a system run a little more smoothly than it did yesterday. In Sam Walton's case, by all the accounts that have survived him, it seems to have been that last thing. He was not moved by the grandeur of his wealth. He was moved by the work itself, by the puzzle. His philosophy about money had an almost contradictory quality to it. He was famously frugal, obsessively so, in ways that sometimes puzzled people who knew him. Even as a billionaire, he would fly coach on commercial airlines rather than charter private jets. He drove older vehicles. He lived in the same modest home in Bentonville that he and Helen had occupied for years, not in any grand manor or estate. When he did give money away, and he gave it away with increasing intention as the years passed, he did so quietly, without the trumpet calls and naming opportunities that had become fashionable among other great philanthropists of the era. And yet there was no trace of self-denial about this. He did not dress plainly out of guilt or penance. He did not avoid luxury out of some Protestant moralism. He seemed, quite simply, to prefer the clarity of a simpler life. The money was real, the wealth was undeniable, but it did not seem to be the true currency of his existence. His currency was still the same one it had always been, the satisfaction of building something that worked, that served people in small towns and rural places that had been largely overlooked by American retail before Walmart came along. There is something deeply moving about this, if you sit with it for a moment. Here was a man who had, quite literally, changed the texture of American commerce, who had made shopping more affordable for hundreds of millions of people, who had proven that you did not need to locate in Manhattan or Chicago or Los Angeles to build something vast, that the overlooked places, the small towns, the rural crossroads, the communities that the old guard of retail had written off as unprofitable, these places held enormous latent demand and enormous value if you were willing to serve them with respect and the same discipline you would bring to any other market. And as that wealth accumulated, and as his name became known, and as he began to be written about in the business press as one of the great entrepreneurs of the century, Sam Walton seemed to have made a quiet choice. The choice was to not let the scale of his success change the fundamental way he operated, to not become distant from the work, to not retreat into the abstraction of wealth, where you no longer see the actual people who make the system function. This is harder than it sounds. Most very successful people, at some point, begin to operate through layers of insulation. They stop visiting the actual stores, the actual offices, the actual places where the real work happens. They begin to see the enterprise as a financial abstraction, a set of numbers on a screen, rather than as a living thing made of human effort and intention. Sam Walton resisted this, as much as any human being could. The question that lingers, in the quietness of the night, is whether this was temperament or principle, whether he was incapable of becoming the distant billionaire, or whether he actively chose not to. Was it that humility came naturally to him, and therefore scaling humility came naturally too? Or was it something he had to continuously choose, a discipline he had to renew every time he walked into one of his stores and saw the prices, the merchandising, the work of the associates, and realized that none of it had changed substantially since 1962, that the fundamental truth of the enterprise, serve the customer, respect the employee, keep the prices low, remove the waste, remained exactly the same, even as the scale had become incomprehensible. Helen Walton, his wife, the person who had stood beside him through all of it, From the Ben Franklin store in Newport through the entire arc of Walmart's rise, seemed to exemplify this same quality. She too had been thrust into extraordinary wealth, and yet she remained, by all accounts, a person of simplicity and grace. They traveled together to the stores, they visited together, they maintained together this very particular culture within Walmart, a culture that somehow managed to be both enormously ambitious in terms of growth, in terms of reach, in terms of market dominance, and at the same time deeply humble in its manner. Was this sustainable? Could humility, genuine humility, actually be maintained at a scale of billions? Or was it inevitably destined to erode, to give way eventually to the weight of so much power and so much money? These are not questions that had easy answers in Sam Walton's lifetime, and they have only become more complex in the decades since. By the spring of 1992, Sam Walton had become something unusual in the landscape of American commerce, a man whose name was as familiar to millions as it was nearly invisible in his own daily life. He still visited stores, still flew his small plane across the country, still asked associates about their families and the details of their work. But the cancer that had begun in his bone marrow was advancing with a quiet, steady progression that no amount of resolve or determination could slow. Those closest to him noticed the exhaustion beneath his characteristic energy. The flights became shorter. The store visits, once his most cherished ritual, grew more brief. Yet even as his strength diminished, there was no dramatic farewell, no grand pronouncement about the future. This was simply how the Waltons did things, with a kind of understated grace that seemed almost at odds with the scale of what they had built. On July 2nd of that year, in Little Rock, surrounded by the people he loved most, Sam Walton died. He was 84 years old. The news, when it spread across the country, was met with something that might seem surprising for a man who had amassed an almost incomprehensible fortune. Many people grieved him, not as a titan, but as someone they felt they had known. Store associates spoke of him as they might speak of a beloved grandfather. Customers in small towns remembered his modest demeanor, the way he seemed genuinely interested in their opinions about prices and merchandise. What happened next, in those months and years that followed, revealed something essential about what the Waltons had created. There was no succession struggle. There were no bitter legal battles between siblings over control. There was no sudden shift in strategy or philosophy, no new regime eager to remake the company in its own image. Instead, what transpired was a kind of seamless, almost quiet transfer of stewardship. Sam's son Rob, who had been deeply involved in operations and strategy for years, naturally assumed the role of chief executive officer, but perhaps more tellingly, the transition was structured so that it was not simply one person stepping into Sam's shoes. The Walton children, Rob, John, Jim, and Alice, understood that their father's greatest gift had never been his personal genius alone. It had been his ability to create a system, a culture, a set of values that could live beyond any single individual. They had watched him build something that could endure. The stock did not plummet on the news of his passing. The stores did not falter. The Saturday morning meetings continued, that peculiar and energetic tradition where associates from across regions gathered to share ideas and hear from leadership. The company's commitment to everyday low prices, the philosophy that had animated every decision Sam had made for 4 decades, remained the North Star. It was as though Sam's presence had become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of what Walmart was, that his physical absence did not tear the seams. This speaks to something that is often overlooked when we examine the lives of great entrepreneurs. We tend to imagine their legacy as something that dies with them, that their particular brilliance cannot be replicated, that their successors are forever playing in their shadow. But the Waltons seemed to understand something different. Sam had not built Walmart around his own indispensability. He had built it around principles, around the notion that ordinary people, given the right tools and the right culture, could accomplish extraordinary things. that humility and listening were strengths, not weaknesses, that taking care of your associates was not charity but sound business. In the months after his death, there were memorials and tributes. Business schools studied his legacy. Retailers across the country took stock of their own operations, wondering how they might have approached things differently had they possessed his particular vision. Yet in Bentonville, in the headquarters, and in the stores themselves, the work continued much as it had. There was a steadiness to it all, a kind of dignity in the way the Walton family did not make a spectacle of their grief or their leadership transition. Helen Walton, Sam's wife of 50 years, maintained a quiet presence. She had been the steadying force throughout their marriage, the person who had supported his ambitions while keeping him grounded in what mattered. She had raised their 4 children with the same values that had guided Sam: thrift, education, generosity when it came to those in need. In her own way, she had been as essential to Walmart's culture as Sam himself, embodying the kind of decency and integrity that the company claimed to represent. The children each brought their own temperament and interests to their expanded roles. There was a natural distribution of responsibility based on aptitude and passion rather than birth order or traditional hierarchies. This too seemed distinctly Walton, practical, meritocratic in its own way, focused on what worked rather than on ego or ritual. They did not need to broadcast their intentions or their plans. They simply continued their father's work, adapting it to a changing world while preserving its essential character. What made this transition so remarkable, so worth examining on a night like this, when the mind is receptive to understanding how institutions truly persist, was that it did not rely on charisma or personality. The Waltons had never made Walmart about Sam Walton, the man. They had made it about an idea that efficiency and respect could coexist, that treating people well and charging fair prices were not obligations that competed with profit, but rather paths toward it. The company had become larger than its founder, not in an impersonal way, but in the sense that the values had become organizational DNA. In the quietness of small towns across America, in the thousands of stores where people came to buy their groceries and their school supplies and their household goods, the work continued unchanged. The prices remained low. The associates remained trained to greet customers with respect. The stores remained clean and well organized. If anything, the absence of Sam's physical presence seemed to strengthen the case that what he had built could survive anything, could adapt to any challenge. His death, in a strange and gentle way, was the final proof of his success. When Sam Walton passed his authority to the next generation, he did not hand over a finished monument. He left behind a living, breathing system, one that demanded different kinds of minds to sustain and expand it. The children he and Helen raised were never groomed in the traditional sense of family succession. There was no boardroom announcement, no formal coronation. Instead, there was something quieter and somehow more powerful. Each of them simply found the place where they could contribute most authentically, as though the company itself had room for their individual gifts. Rob Walton, the eldest son, became the architect of retail expansion itself, where his father had been intuitive, almost feverish in his store visits. Rob brought a different temperament, methodical, strategic, unafraid of data and systems. He understood that what had worked in rural Arkansas and small southern towns needed to be codified, replicated, refined. As Walmart began its serious push beyond the South in the 1980s and into the 1990s, it was Rob who helped translate Sam's philosophy into operational frameworks that could scale across time zones and demographics. He was not a showman, he was an engineer of growth. There was something almost austere about his approach, yet it worked. By the time he became chief executive officer in 1992, just as his father was fading, Rob had already proven himself capable of thinking several moves ahead, in a game that few others understood. John Walton, the second son, took a path that seemed to diverge from retail almost entirely. He became deeply involved in banking, and through that lens, he began to understand the Walton fortune not just as a merchant's accumulation, but as capital that could move through other systems. Banking gave him access to different networks, different conversations. He learned how money flowed through communities, how credit shaped possibility. What might have looked, on the surface, like stepping away from the family business was actually a widening of the aperture. John understood something essential. The Waltons' power would eventually extend far beyond store shelves. It would reach into education, health, and the very infrastructure of American philanthropy. His quietness, he was perhaps the most private of the Walton children, concealed a sharp, observant mind. Jim Walton, the youngest son, gravitated toward ranching and land stewardship, where retail required you to be constantly optimizing, constantly watching the customer. Ranching demanded patience, long-term thinking, and a respect for natural rhythms that did not obey quarterly earnings calls. Jim purchased substantial ranching operations, and through this work, he became connected to questions of land use, conservation, and sustainable agriculture. It was as though he asked a different kind of question than his brothers, not how to move more goods, but how to hold and steward something living across generations. His work in ranching would eventually inform significant philanthropic efforts in environmental conservation, efforts that would reshape how American wealth engaged with landscape and climate. And then there was Alice Walton, the only daughter. Her path was perhaps the most unconventional of all. While her brothers carved out institutional roles, Alice moved through business, but always seemed to be circling something else. She had a restless intellectual quality, a hunger for meaning that retail and finance alone could not satisfy. She would eventually become fascinated by art, by the power of beauty and human creativity to move people in ways that a low price on toothpaste simply could not. She studied business, yes, but she also traveled. She looked, she asked questions. There was a sense, even in her younger years, that she was preparing for a role that had not yet been invented, one that would allow her to spend her inherited wealth on nourishment rather than just accumulation. What was remarkable about this second generation was that they did not fight over their father's legacy. They did not struggle against it or try to prove themselves by dismantling what he had built. Instead, they seemed to understand intuitively that the company and the fortune were large enough to accommodate multiple expressions of their values. Rob could expand retail, while John explored finance. Jim could steward land while Alice pursued artistic vision. There was no competition for the throne because there was no throne. There was only a vast, multifaceted enterprise and a family fortune, and each of them found the corner of it that called to them. This divergence was not accidental. Sam Walton himself had modeled a kind of flexibility, a willingness to experiment. He had been a pilot, a hunter, a small-town merchant, a competitor obsessed with his rivals. He had worn many hats. He had given his children permission, through his example if not his words, to be complex. And so when succession came, it came not as a narrowing but as a flowering. The Walton children inherited not a rulebook, but a philosophy, a belief that ordinary people deserved good prices, that persistence and attention mattered, that a business could be a force for some kind of good in the world. They took that inheritance, and each began, quietly, to ask what it might mean to live by it in their own distinct way. The company itself, meanwhile, continued its relentless expansion. By the time the 1990s were well underway, Walmart was no longer a regional phenomenon. It was becoming the largest retailer in the world, remaking the American landscape, changing how people shopped and what they expected to pay. And at the center of this vast, impersonal machine were these 5 people, 4 sons and 1 daughter, each of them trying to understand their own relationship to power and responsibility, each of them trying to answer, in their own way, the question that all inheritors of great fortune must eventually face. What does it mean to be a steward of something this large? As the company matured into a vast retail empire, something curious began to unfold within the Walton family consciousness. The accumulation of extraordinary wealth, rather than simply settling into the comfortable rhythms of privilege, seemed to awaken in them a different kind of restlessness. The question that arises when someone possesses more than they could ever spend, more than their grandchildren's grandchildren could spend. What does one do with such abundance? And perhaps more quietly still, what responsibility travels alongside it? In 1987, the same year that Walmart crossed the threshold of truly national dominance, the Walton Family Foundation was established, though it would take several more years before the family fully articulated what they wanted it to become. Unlike many philanthropic ventures that emerge from the desire for recognition or the settling of conscience, the Walton Foundation seemed to grow from something more deliberate and almost understated, a belief that the principles which had guided Sam's business life might, in some translated form, guide how the family stewarded their fortune. Helen Walton, Sam's quiet partner in the original vision, had always carried a deep concern for education. She had taught in schools herself, long ago, before the business consumed the family's days and nights, and that early intimacy with classrooms and learning seemed never to fully leave her. So when the foundation began to take shape, education became not merely one focus among many, but something approaching a central mission. The family wanted to understand how educational systems in America actually worked, where the breakdowns occurred, and whether the same kind of disciplined analysis that had built a retail behemoth might illuminate paths toward better schools. This led them, beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the early years of the 21st century, into the complex and often contentious world of education reform. The foundation began to fund charter schools, not as an ideological statement exactly, but as an experiment, a way of testing whether new models of school organization, pedagogy, and accountability might emerge if given resources and freedom from traditional constraints. There is something worth noting here, a kind of paradox worth sitting with. The same family whose retail dominance had occasionally felt overwhelming to small-town merchants were now inserting themselves into the equally fraught terrain of how America's children learned. The work was neither straightforwardly celebrated nor universally welcomed. Some educators and policymakers saw the foundation's investments as genuine attempts to solve intractable problems, the persistent achievement gaps, the underfunding of rural schools, the ways that poverty constrains what students could access or become. Others viewed it with something closer to skepticism or concern, wondering whether billionaire-directed philanthropy, however well-intentioned, was the appropriate vehicle for shaping public education. The complexity of that tension deserves to sit quietly in the listener's mind without easy resolution. Because the Waltons were not monsters imposing a tyrannical vision, yet neither were they immune to the challenges that arise when concentrated wealth meets democratic institutions that were supposed to belong to everyone. What is perhaps most interesting is that the family seemed genuinely engaged with the actual empirical questions at stake. Which charter school designs actually improved student outcomes, particularly for low-income students? Where did charter expansion seem to strengthen educational ecosystems, and where did it fragment them? The foundation funded research and evaluation alongside its grants, suggesting a sincere curiosity about what worked and what didn't, rather than a fixed ideological commitment that could admit no doubt. That quality of openness, of willingness to follow evidence even when it complicated the family's preferred narratives, echoes something of Sam's original merchant mentality, the careful observation of what the customer actually wanted versus what you assumed they should want. But education was not the family's only concern, as their influence rippled outward beyond retail. There emerged, particularly among some of the younger generation of Waltons, a deep commitment to environmental conservation. This interest seemed to grow partly from the family's deep roots in the American landscape. Their ranching operations in Wyoming and other western states gave them intimate knowledge of wild lands, of water systems, of ecosystems under pressure from development and climate change. Rob Walton, Sam's eldest son, became particularly involved in conservation philanthropy, funding land purchases and preservation efforts across the West and around the world. There is something almost lyrical about this trajectory, if one steps back far enough to see it. A family that had made its fortune in the most thoroughly modern, efficient, optimization-obsessed enterprise imaginable: discount retail, supply chain management, the radical reduction of friction between production and consumption, finding themselves drawn to protect places and systems that resisted such total optimization. Wild lands, forests, rivers that moved according to their own logic, ecosystems in which the human hand had deliberately chosen restraint. Was this a kind of balancing impulse? A recognition that the world needed both the incredible productive efficiency that Walmart exemplified and also the preservation of things that had no price, no profit margin, no quarterly growth metric. The Foundation's conservation work took on remarkable scale. The family became major funders of land trusts and national parks, supporters of climate change research, backers of efforts to restore watersheds and protect biodiversity. In Wyoming and Montana, their ranching operations were managed with explicit conservation goals alongside cattle production. There was something almost touching about this. The Waltons, who had grown wealthy through an almost aggressive form of market capitalism, using portions of those earnings to preserve lands from the market entirely, holding them in conservation trusts where they would remain protected in perpetuity. And yet, as with education, one should resist the impulse to construct a simple redemption narrative. Conservation philanthropy is not inherently uncomplicated. Questions arose, and still do, about whether land preservation efforts sometimes served elite interests or environmental preferences, about whether conservation priorities aligned or confided with the needs and cultures of rural communities. The Waltons' vast land holdings in the West, however conscientiously managed, existed alongside the reality that wealth creates power, and power shapes which visions of the land get realized and which are subordinated. What does seem clear, as one observes the arc of the family's philanthropic work across decades, is that they were genuinely thinking about stewardship. They had inherited not only unimaginable wealth, but also the company and values that Sam had built, a particular philosophy about how business should operate, how communities should be served. The Foundation represented an extension of that thinking into domains that retail could not reach: education, conservation, the attempt to improve systems that shaped lives in fundamental ways. Whether those efforts succeeded, where they achieved their aims and where they fell short, where they helped and where they inadvertently harmed, those remain open questions, the kind that history continues to examine and refine as the decades pass. Yet as the Walton family's fortune accumulated, as the blue vests multiplied across highways and main streets, as Walmart's purchasing power reshaped the entire machinery of American commerce, a quieter story began to unfold in the spaces between the bright aisles and the cheerful greeters. Not a story of triumph alone, but of consequence. Not judgment, but acknowledgement of the intricate weight that scale itself imposes. The criticism, when it began to crystallize in the 1980s and 1990s, emerged from a place of genuine tension. Here was a company that had built its fortune on small towns, on the principle of serving people who had few other options, and yet its very success created a gravity that pulled resources away from the local stores that had come before it. A Walmart opening in a small rural community often meant that the family-owned hardware store 2 blocks away, the clothing boutique that had served 3 generations, the pharmacy where the owner knew your mother's maiden name, would eventually close. This was not malice. This was mathematics. This was the logic of scale meeting the logic of survival. And the Waltons, throughout their expansion, seemed genuinely bewildered by the notion that they bore responsibility for these closures, since they were simply offering lower prices, which was, they believed, what the consumer wanted. The labor question moved more slowly into public consciousness, but it proved more enduring. Walmart's wage structure, particularly in its earlier decades, reflected the company's founding principle: keep costs low so that prices could fall further. Entry-level positions in the stores paid wages that, while not necessarily lower than competitors in that era, were often insufficient for full-time workers to live without assistance. Some relied on public benefits, food stamps, housing assistance, Medicaid, which meant that the American taxpayer was, in effect, subsidizing Walmart's labor model. This dynamic only became more visible as poverty statistics were scrutinized and healthcare costs rose. It raised a question that has never quite been settled, even in sleep. If a company can be profitable, can grow, can generate immense wealth while paying workers wages below a living threshold, is that a flaw in the company's ethics or a flaw in the broader economic system that allows it? Sam Walton himself, in his later years, expressed genuine uncertainty about this. He believed in rewarding hard work, in offering bonuses to store managers who hit targets, in creating a culture where employee ownership meant something. And yet the company's pressure to maintain margins, to expand, to undercut competitors, created a gravitational pull that worked against generosity at the ground level. The tension was real, not invented by critics. It was felt by store managers, caught between corporate directives and the faces of people they knew struggling to pay rent. It was felt by the Walton children as they inherited not just a fortune, but the company's moral ambiguities. The question of market dominance moved through similar layers of complexity. By the time Walmart became the nation's largest retailer, its scale gave it immense bargaining power with suppliers. A manufacturer's decision to work with Walmart or not could determine viability. This power was wielded, in many cases, with discipline and fairness. But it was power nonetheless. Walmart could demand price reductions that suppliers then had to find somewhere else in their operations, sometimes by moving manufacturing overseas, where labor was cheaper. The company was not unique in this practice, but its scale made it consequential. The same low prices that delighted shoppers in small towns contributed, in complex and indirect ways, to the hollowing out of manufacturing in those same towns. Cause and effect were separated by layers of supply chains, and economic forces too vast for any single actor to control entirely. And yet Walmart's choices aggregated into something that shaped the geography of American work itself. What made these criticisms particularly poignant, perhaps, was that they were not leveled at a heartless corporation by people in distant cities. Many of the most pointed critiques came from rural America itself, the very constituency Walmart had served. Local business owners felt betrayed, workers felt undervalued, communities felt the loss of local ownership and decision-making, and the Waltons, who had built their empire on understanding small-town values, seemed sometimes to miss that small towns also valued independence, relationships, and the dignity that came from being a place where decisions were made locally rather than by distant headquarters. Yet it would be incomplete not to acknowledge that Walmart also created opportunity. For many people in rural areas with limited job options, Walmart employment was genuine work. For people living on thin margins, the company's low prices meant real money back in their pockets. For suppliers, Walmart's efficiency created a new standard that elevated their own operations. For shareholders, including many Walton employees with stock ownership plans, the company's growth built wealth. The picture is not clean, it is layered. It contains genuine good alongside genuine harm, and the complexity of that mixture is what makes the Walton story so difficult to settle into any single moral conclusion. As the company matured, and as the second and third generations of Waltons began to shape strategy, some of these tensions began to receive attention. Wage discussions evolved, sustainability practices gained focus. The Walton Family Foundation, growing in parallel with the company itself, committed billions to education, environmental conservation, and community development. Whether these efforts represented genuine commitment to addressing past imbalances, or public relations in service of image management, or some authentic mixture of both, remains a question that thoughtful observers still gently debate, usually late at night, in the kind of reflective mood that precedes sleep. When we speak of $250 billion in the hands of one family, the number itself can feel almost abstract, almost unreal, as if we've crossed some threshold where mathematics becomes poetry rather than fact. And perhaps that's the only honest way to approach a sum so vast that it resists true comprehension. To hold it in mind is to hold something larger than most nations' annual economies. Yet it arrived not through conquest or inheritance of ancient gold, but through the patient accumulation of small transactions, one customer at a time, across 70 years. The scale of the Walton fortune becomes clearer, perhaps, when we measure it not against other numbers, but against the arc of time and the texture of American economic life itself. Consider that when Sam Walton was born, in 1918, the wealthiest families in America were those who had built empires in oil, in steel, in railroads. Those fortunes had crystallized in the late 1800s, in an era when there was still frontier to claim, when capital and ambition could carve monopolies from virgin terrain. The Waltons' fortune, by contrast, emerged in an age of regulation, of taxation, of supposed constraints. It grew not from controlling a scarce resource, but from understanding an abundance of small-town desire and learning to serve it more efficiently than anyone else had imagined possible. In that sense, the sheer size of what Sam built speaks to something almost paradoxical, that in an era supposedly hostile to vast private fortunes, he created one of the largest the modern world has ever seen, not by fighting the system, but by operating within it, sometimes even ahead of it. To place this wealth in historical context requires us to think about what $250 billion meant in different eras. When Sam opened his first Bentonville store in 1962, $250 billion would have been beyond the gross domestic product of entire continents. Yet by the time his grandchildren came into their inheritance, it was merely the inheritance of one family among many, albeit one of the largest. The fortune's growth was not unique in its direction. Wealth in America, like water, tends to flow toward those who already have it. But it was unusual in its origin point. Most great American fortunes were established by the early 20th century. The Walton fortune was established in the second half of it, which means it compressed several generations of wealth building into a single lifetime and then into the lifetimes of his children. The nature of how this fortune is held tells us something important about its character. Unlike the industrial fortunes of the 19th century, which were often locked in single companies or single sectors, the Walton wealth has fractured and diversified across generations. Some Waltons have focused intently on Walmart, serving as board members and executives and guardians of the original enterprise. Others have deliberately stepped away, choosing instead to deploy their capital toward education, conservation, art museums, democratic reform. This dispersion is not weakness, but rather a kind of evolutionary adaptation to the problem of managing incomprehensible wealth across a family. To concentrate it entirely would risk repeating the patterns of earlier dynasty building that often ended in feuds and decline. To scatter it entirely would dilute the family's coherence. They have attempted something in between, a careful balance that is itself a kind of discipline. It bears noticing that the Walton family fortune, vast as it is, has never been the largest fortune in America. Berkshire Hathaway's Warren Buffett has held that distinction at various points, as have others. This detail matters because it suggests that what the Waltons built was remarkable not because it was the most extreme, but because it emerged from the most ordinary circumstances, from the democratic, small-town American landscape that anyone might have observed. The fortune was not built on disruption in the modern sense, not on innovation that rendered previous technologies obsolete, but on the systematic and patient application of known principles to an underserved market. It is almost a quiet kind of empire, if an empire can ever be quiet. When we consider this wealth against the backdrop of American inequality today, we might pause and ask what it means that a single family possesses more liquid assets than the annual income of millions of American households combined. The Waltons are not poor, nor are they particularly burdened by the constraints that ordinary citizens face. Yet neither are they removed from society in the way that the wealthiest industrialists of the Gilded Age were. Many of them still work, still oversee operations, still maintain a connection to the original enterprise that created their fortune. They may move through the world with incomparably more ease than most people, yes, but they move through the same world, governed by the same laws, and subject to the same social pressures that shape all American life. Whether this proximity to the ordinary suffuses their decision-making or merely provides convenient proximity to suffering they need not relieve is perhaps a question worth holding gently, without rushing toward judgment. The money itself, too, has become a kind of abstraction. $250 billion in the early 21st century does not sit in vaults or in hidden accounts. It is distributed across investments, across real estate, across financial instruments so complex that even those who inherit it must employ teams of specialists to understand what they possess. In this sense, the Walton fortune is not really a fortune in the old sense. Not a hoard, not a treasury, not something you could walk through and touch. It is rather a claim upon the productive capacity of the American economy, a share so substantial that the family's decisions about where to deploy capital ripple across markets and communities in ways both visible and invisible. And perhaps this is the deepest truth about the scale of the Walton wealth in our current moment. It is not the raw number that matters most, but rather the question of what the existence of such inequality, such concentration, such disparity between one family and millions of others tells us about the systems we have built and the choices we continue to make as a society. The fortune itself is morally neutral. It is neither good nor evil. It is what people do with it, and what they fail to do with it, that carries moral weight. And that story is still being written, still unfolding across the years and the generations yet to come. And so we find ourselves in Bentonville, as the sun descends, casting long shadows across the Ozark Hills, that Sam Walton came to know by heart, that he flew above in his small plane, that shaped the quiet geography of his ambition. The town has grown, transformed by the very force that once seemed so unlikely to originate there. A discount retail empire that rewrote the rules of American commerce from the Ozark foothills outward, rippling across the country, changing the way millions of people shopped, the wages they earned, the distances they traveled to find what they needed. If you were to walk the streets of Bentonville now, and could somehow drift backward through time, you might see the layers settling like sediment. The first modest store, with its hand-painted signs and the hand-written price reductions that Sam believed in so deeply. Then the cautious expansion across Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, then down into Texas and Louisiana, a gradual, almost humble growth that never announced itself too loudly, never took credit for what it was becoming. And beneath those layers, before any of it, there was a man with a pickup truck and an idea that ordinary people in ordinary towns deserved to pay less for the things they needed, that respect for the customer meant respecting their pocketbooks, their time, their dignity. The question that settles over Bentonville now, as dusk deepens, is perhaps one without a simple answer. How does one life, one man's restless energy, his willingness to learn from everyone around him, his almost obsessive attention to detail, translate into a legacy that spans generations and reshapes an entire nation's retail landscape? There is no formula written in any business school that fully explains it. Part of it was timing, certainly. The rise of the automobile, the interstate system, the rural electrification that had finally reached the places where Sam chose to build. Part of it was geography, the overlooked small towns that larger retailers had abandoned, leaving an opening for someone with the vision to see opportunity where others saw only distance and difficulty. But there was something else too, something harder to measure or quantify, something that whispers through the story of the Waltons if you listen closely enough. It was a consistency of values, an almost stubborn belief that business could be conducted with integrity, that employees mattered, that the customer's satisfaction was not a slogan to be printed in annual reports, but a daily practice to be lived. Sam Walton visited stores personally for decades, long after he had every reason to remain in an office, long after his wealth had grown beyond the comprehension of most people. He walked the aisles, he talked to the employees, he asked questions, he listened to what they said. That quality of attention, of showing up, of genuinely caring whether the merchandise was well organized and whether the prices were as low as they could possibly be. These things do not scale easily in the way that an algorithm scales, and yet they seem to scale nonetheless, passed down through his children, through their children, woven into the culture of an organization that by any measure had become almost incomprehensibly large. There is something almost mysterious about that transmission of values across such distance and time, the way a small-town ethic somehow survived the growth into a global enterprise. The Walton children, Rob and John and Jim and Alice, each of them found their own path within and beyond the family business. Some continued in retail, shaping the direction of Walmart as it matured. Others moved toward other forms of influence and impact: conservation, education, banking. What seemed to unite them was not necessarily agreement about every decision or direction, but rather a shared sense that their inheritance carried with it a responsibility. The fortune was not simply to be held or enjoyed, though of course it could be. It was something that came with an obligation to think about how it might be used, how it might shape the world they were passing on to the next generation. The Walton Family Foundation emerged as one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the United States, channeling billions toward education reform, environmental conservation, rural development. Whether one agrees with every choice they have made or every initiative they have funded is a separate question. Philanthropy is never neutral. It always reflects particular values and priorities. But the fact that the wealth generated by a discount retailer in the Ozarks has been deployed toward these purposes at such a scale speaks to something about the way the family understood their place in the world. They had been given much. They seemed to feel, at some level, that they were stewards of something larger than themselves. As the sky deepens above Bentonville, moving from the amber of early dusk toward the soft indigo of evening, there is a kind of quietness that settles over the town. It is not the quietness of emptiness or abandonment. Rather, it is the quietness of a place that has been thoroughly transformed and yet somehow retains some essential quality of its origins. The Ozark Hills still surround it. The weather still turns with the seasons in the same way it always did. People still live and work and raise their families there, building lives that are connected, for better or worse, to the legacy of one man's decision to open a small store and sell things cheaply. What does it mean, in the end, that a pickup truck journey led to $250 billion? Perhaps it means different things to different people. For some, it is a story of American possibility, of the idea that talent and hard work and a willingness to think differently can lead to extraordinary success, even from humble origins. For others, it is more complicated, a story about market concentration, about the displacement of small retailers who could not compete, about labor practices that have been criticized and debated for decades. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The world is rarely neat enough to allow for only one interpretation. But there is perhaps another layer to consider as well, quieter than the others. It is the simple fact that somewhere along the way, a man from the Ozarks realized that ordinary people deserved better, that the prices charged to them did not have to be exploitative, that treating them with respect was not naive or sentimental, but actually sound business practice. That belief, however imperfectly it may have been executed, however complicated the results, was not a small thing. It changed how millions of people shopped. It changed what they were able to afford. It changed the geography of commerce in rural America. The lights of Bentonville are beginning to come on now as dusk fades further toward night. The streets are quieter than they were during the day. Cars move slowly through the town. In some distant building, someone is working late, and in some home, someone is settling in for the evening, preparing for rest. Above, if the clouds clear, the stars will begin to appear, the same stars that looked down on the Ozarks long before Sam Walton was born, long before the first Walmart store, long before any of this. To contemplate a legacy is often to contemplate impermanence as well. Nothing lasts forever. The Walton fortune, vast as it is, will eventually disperse in ways that are difficult to predict. The Walmart stores that seemed so revolutionary in their time will evolve and change, adapting to whatever future retail takes as it continues to transform. The town of Bentonville itself will continue to grow and shift. The very landscape, the hills and roads, will remain while everything built upon them becomes unrecognizable over time. And yet in the moment of this dusk, with the sun settling below the horizon and the world beginning to release its grip on the wakefulness of day, there is something peaceful in the thought of a simple idea persisting over time. A man believed that ordinary people deserved respect and good prices. He built an institution around that belief. His children inherited it and steered it in various directions. And across generations now, that belief continues to shape how millions of people live, work, and spend their days. The pickup truck that once carried Sam Walton along the roads of Arkansas, the modest Ben Franklin store that he purchased with such hope and eventually lost, the first Walmart with its hand-painted signs, these things are past now, preserved only in memory and photograph and the continuing stories that people tell. But the current that they set in motion flows onward still, carrying with it everything that has happened since, all the success and the criticism and the change and the constancy, all of it flowing together like a river finding its way down from the hills toward some distant and unknowable destination. As Bentonville settles into night, as the lights in the stores and offices gradually dim, as the people who work there move toward their own rest, there is perhaps a kind of completion in this moment. A chapter closes. A man's life, dedicated to a single idea pursued with extraordinary discipline and consistency, becomes history, and what remains is the legacy itself, invisible but present, woven into the economic life of the nation, into the way people shop and work and think about value. The darkness deepens, the sounds of the day fade, and in this gentle descent toward sleep, we might carry with us the strange and quiet knowledge that the world we live in was shaped, in part, by a man from the Ozarks who believed that ordinary people deserved to pay less, who showed up and paid attention, who built something that lasted, not perfectly, not without cost, but genuinely, persistently, with a kind of steady determination that seems almost at odds with the scale of what it eventually became. Sleep comes now, as it comes every night, as it came to Sam Walton, and as it comes to his children and their children, and to everyone who ever passed through a Walmart store and found something they needed at a price they could afford. The question is not answered fully. Perhaps it never will be. But in the answering, in the long journey through one man's life and the legacy of his labor, there is a kind of peace. The Ozarks remain, Bentonville rests, and the quiet continues, as it always does, into the darkness.